Well, good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. My name is Jill Halford, and I'm the National Head of Charities here at BDO. I hope you've all been keeping safe and well. This is our latest charity webinar in our charity webinar series, Charity Fraud and Cybercrime, the Impact of the Pandemic. If you couldn't attend the previous webinars that we've ran and are keen to watch recordings, then please do let us know. We can send you through links to those. And also you can register for those previous ones on the charity pages of the BDO website. So just to kick off, I wanted to cover a few housekeeping points. We are recording today's session and we'll circulate the slides and the recording early next week. We do have quite a number registered for today's call. We've got nearly 200 people registered. I can see the numbers ticking up at the bottom of my screen as people are joining. So if you could keep yourself on mute as the speakers are talking, that would be incredibly helpful just to minimise the disruption. Feel free to keep your cameras on or off during that session as well. We do really welcome any comments and questions that you have as the speakers are talking, but if you could please pop those into the Q&A box towards the bottom of your screen. We'll be fielding those behind the scenes and we'll save some time towards the end for a Q&A. If you are having any technical issues, maybe some problems with sound, then again, do let us know through that Q&A function and we will try to assist. So what will be covered today? So in conjunction with the Charity Fraud Awareness Week, which ran back in October, we joined up with the Fraud Advisory Panel to conduct a survey to understand the impact of the COVID pandemic on the charity sector in the UK and to evaluate how it's affected the fraud landscape for charities and determine what charities can do better to protect themselves. So it's a really important topic. The sector has experienced an increase in reported fraud since the pandemic started. And I've not audited this figure, but I saw an article a couple of weeks ago saying that it was now at about £8 million that's been reported, and also doubling of instances of cybercrime as well. So very much a live and important topic. So I'm really pleased to be joined by a selection of experts today. Really pleased that we've got Mia Campbell, who heads up the Fraud Advisory Panel, and she's going to take us through some of the highlights that came out of our combined survey. Kaylee Crosswaite, who heads up BDO's forensic services, and she'll be talking us through some of the common areas of fraud and some case studies that we've seen. And then finally, my great colleague, Jason Gottschalk, a partner in our digital cyber crime team, who's going to talk us through demystifying cyber. And then, as I say, we'll save some time towards the end for any questions that you have. And if we can't get through all of the questions, we'll make sure that we take those away and get back to you. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Mia.
Thanks so much, Jill, for the introduction, and good morning, everyone. As Jill's already mentioned, BDO and the Fraud Advisory Panel this week have actually launched the report supporting the findings that we got from our survey that we conducted back in September, looking at the impact of the pandemic on fraud within the sector. And I'm going to share some of those key findings with you today. But before I do, I thought it might be useful to briefly explain who the Fraud Advisory Panel is, just for the benefit of those of you who may never have heard of us. So we're a charity ourselves and we work solely to raise awareness of fraud and financial crime. And we do this in three ways. We provide advice and information about fraud risks. We educate, train and support counter-fraud professionals. And we undertake research to improve our understanding and knowledge about fraud. I think it's also really important for me just to mention that as a charity ourselves, and actually we're a small one at that, we have a particular interest in supporting other charities to protect themselves from fraud. And we have a really long history of doing so. 10 years ago, in conjunction with the Charity Commission, we actually undertook one of the first pieces of research to examine the extent of fraud affecting the sector. And we repeated that again back in 2019, so right before the pandemic struck. And of course, this new research with BDO follows on very nicely from this. As most of you are probably already aware, and Jill's already touched upon this, fraud is a significant problem, both in the UK and elsewhere. Here in the UK, it's now believed to account for more than a third of all reported crime, and most of that is actually committed online now. And so this really does make it a significant risk to every person, to every organisation, and of course also to every charity. It's also sad but true that fraudsters thrive in crises like the pandemic, as well as the economic difficulties that often accompany them. And because the pandemic has actually changed the way that many of us are operating and probably will continue to operate for quite some time yet, it has actually created some potentially new vulnerabilities. And it's also probably exposed some weaknesses that we may also have, which fraudsters and cybercriminals will always seek to exploit. Last year alone, Charities reported losses of 8.6 million to Action Fraud, and that's the National Fraud and Cybercrime Reporting Centre. And this is actually likely to be a significant underestimate because we know a lot of fraud goes undetected and a lot of it goes unreported to law enforcement. Over the same period, the Charity Commission has actually seen a 75% increase in the number of whistleblowing reports that it receives. And most of these come from current or former staff members, followed by trustees and volunteers, and are primarily related to issues surrounding governance failures and financial harms. And the financial harms bit is obviously going to include a number of instances around fraud as well. And it's against this backdrop that we conducted our research. So I'd just like to share a couple of the findings with you now. So we began by asking respondents to our survey to indicate how strongly they agreed or disagreed with a series of statements. And as you can see from the slide on front of you now, perhaps unsurprisingly, given what I've already said about fraud during the pandemic, almost 2/3 of respondents said that the pandemic had increased the risk of fraud to their charity. But despite this, only half thought that the pandemic had actually made it more difficult to manage these risks. And this is probably for a variety of reasons. It could well be because some charities already had a remote workforce before the pandemic struck, or because they had already had controls or plans in place to deal with such a crisis and were therefore much more able to adapt quickly. For example, thinking about our own charity, we anticipated the first national lockdown, and we'd already put measures in place to shift to 100% home working, and we already worked part-time in the office anyway. So for us, the shift was pretty seamless and easy for us to do. Could I please have the next slide? Perhaps more importantly for today's webinar, however, I think is the next finding, which shows that the charities surveyed expect that the risk of fraud to their organisations is going to increase or remain the same over the next 12 months. And I think this is something that we at the Fraud Advisor Panel completely agree with. We think that there probably will be a bit of an increase over the coming months. Particularly, some of those will be new frauds, but some of those will be existing frauds that come to light. We know that fraudsters are often fleet of foot and are quick to adapt to changing circumstances too. And we've seen this throughout the pandemic, even in the types of phishing emails that we receive into our inboxes. And so because of this and against this backdrop, it's really important that we remain vigilant. I think we're definitely not out of the woods yet. So it's really important that we do stay alert to these risks. I think it's also somewhat concerning that 14% of charities did not put any money at all into fraud prevention efforts within their charities, even some of the larger ones. And this finding might sound quite strange, but actually it's supported by other research. 2 years ago, when we surveyed a much larger pool of charities, we found that almost half didn't have any good practice fraud prevention measures in place. And by that, I mean things like a risk register that includes fraud, relevant policies such as an anti-fraud policy or a whistleblowing policy, fraud awareness training, or a response plan, amongst other things. Similarly, the ACFE, the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners, has also found that charities generally have fewer anti-fraud controls in place than other organisations, and this can make them more vulnerable to fraud as well. So it's really important to remember that the mechanisms we put in place to manage the risk of fraud, they don't always need to be expensive, they don't always need to be complicated, but they usually do require a little bit of time, a little bit of money, a little bit of effort, and a little bit of resource. And we also need to be mindful that it's often cheaper and much less time consuming and damaging to our organisations to stop fraud from happening in the first place than trying to deal with the aftermath. Hannah, could I have the next slide, please? Moving on to the types of fraud that were affecting the charities who responded to our survey, these are the common risks on screen now. The three most common frauds experienced were payment diversion fraud, theft or cash or assets, and financial misreporting. And these were followed in almost equal measure by procurement fraud, fake beneficiaries, and the testing of card payments, amongst other things. There was also an almost equal split between internal fraud and external fraud, which I think is a little bit of a step change from previous research in this area. When we did our last piece of research back in 2019, we found that only 14% of fraudsters had no known connection to the charity. So that's probably reflective of to some degree to the surge in phishing emails that we've seen and online frauds that we've seen over the pandemic, I would suggest. The results also show that fraud prevention efforts cannot be focused on one risk area alone. We need to recognise that fraudsters often seek out the weakest link, or they'll test for the greatest opportunities and try and exploit those. And that the risk to our charities also come from both inside and out. But there is some good news, and that's that there are a lot of good things that we can do to protect our charities. And one of those things, which I think doesn't cost anything, is to simply be aware of the risks and to think about how our organisations might be affected. And that's why webinars like today's webinar are so important. I know that Kaylee and Jason will go into some of the risks in a bit more detail and will offer some practical insights into what they're seeing on the fraud and cyber front. But before I hand over to them, I just wanted to point you in the direction of two initiatives that I think might also help. Hannah, if I could have the next slide, please. The first of these is a new website, which is www.preventcharityfraud.org.uk. And that was launched in September as a joint venture between ourselves and the Charity Commission. And it contains a whole raft of free resources, largely written for fraud professionals by fraud professionals and those working within the sector. And they include things like help sheets, case studies, and on-demand webinars. And we'll be looking to add to those over the coming months and years. You'll also find there a copy of the research report, which I've just sort of talked through, and that's also available on the BDO website too. Hannah, could I have the next slide, please? The website also contains a new fraud pledge, and it sets out 6 basic steps that we think all charities, regardless of size, should be able to take to help protect themselves from fraud. If you haven't already, I would encourage you to take a look at it, and if you can, to sign up to it. By signing up to the pledge, I think you can show your commitment to tackling fraud. I also think it acts as a bit of a powerful deterrent to would-be fraudsters that the sector, both individually and collectively, are taking proactive measures to combat the problem. And while many of you are probably already doing a lot of these things, I think it serves as a useful reminder of the importance of getting the basics right. I think at that point I shall stop and I'll hand back over to you, Jill. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mia. That was really helpful. So just to introduce Kaylee, who's going to take us through some common areas of fraud that we've experienced.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks, Jill. Sorry, I was just trying to find my unmute button then. So thanks to Jill for the opportunity to come and speak to you today. So I head up the National Forensic and Valuations team at BDO, and that also includes our forensic technology team. And I thought today it might be quite helpful just to talk you through some of the common areas of fraud that we see and give you some of the examples of the kind of cases that we've worked on, so that you can hear a little bit about the kind of things that we come across, unfortunately, on a regular basis. One of the things I would stress, though, is that I've been doing this for well over 20 years. And I'm just working on a case at the moment in the charity and not-for-profit sector. And there are a set of circumstances that I have never come across before. So it's right when Mia says that fraudsters are agile and we are constantly chasing new and innovative ways that they have thought about to defraud organisations, unfortunately. Okay, moving on to the slides. There is an awful lot of content in the slides that that I've prepared for the seminar today. I don't propose to go through all of the content of the slide, but I thought it might be useful for listeners to use it maybe as a point of reference later on, and I'm certainly happy to take questions at the end. But the common types of fraud areas that we see, and I've split this out into internal and external areas, and you'll have seen from the charity fraud survey results that of the charities that did suffer a fraud in the last 12 months, the fraudsters were equally split between internal and external perpetrators. I thought it might be worth mentioning, though, that BDO has conducted a wider piece of research over the last 15 plus years called Fraud Track. I know many of you will be aware of it. And that looks across all sectors, and it looks at fraud that's been reported that's over £50,000. And the results from the Fraud Track research do tell us that often, more often than not, there is somebody internal to the organisation that has been involved to some degree. Now, that might be a very small part that they've played in it, partly because of, for example, social engineering, and I'll come on to that a little bit later on. But I cannot stress this enough, that the culture of the organisations that you are involved with is critical. So we have our regulator who comes to speak to us. I do a lot of work within the financial services sector and other regulated sectors, and all of the regulators are stressing the same thing, which is look at your organisation's culture. Think about how you manage that culture and review it on a regular basis. So certainly for BDO as an organisation, we take our culture very seriously, and we're constantly reviewing what our view is of that culture, how it's changing. Is it changing as a result of internal or external factors? We've all been through unprecedented times in the pandemic. How has the pandemic impacted on your organisation's culture? Try and put a wet towel around your head, sit with your colleagues and really think about that. Maybe run internal surveys. You cannot stress that enough. It is absolutely critical that you are aware of what the culture is. And if there is a culture of trust, or perhaps a culture of large personalities who perhaps want to circumnavigate some of the compliance or the controls that you have in place, really think about the way that that impacts on the rest of the team, etc. So just talking about the kind of internal frauds that we see on a regular basis, we see asset misappropriation and the diversion of income, whether that's grants, donations or fundraising. We see expense and payroll fraud, and I'll give some examples of the kind of things that we've seen in a little bit more detail later on. Income generation frauds, which is the kind of traditional fraud that we all think of in our minds when we think of fraud, which is where the fraudster will generate funds for themselves, usually through manipulation of internal financial and IT systems and controls. We see a lot of fraudulent invoices and misuse of bank accounts, credit and debit cards, often very simple ways of starting frauds. Frauds can start very small. So fraudsters will just test, can I get away with this? They'll see an opportunity, can I get away with this? Start small and then realize that actually, that worked. Let me try again, a little bit bigger. Some of the frauds that we've seen, unfortunately, have been going on for decades within organizations. And when we've looked into that, we've seen very small, dip my toe in the water fraudsters building up to very, very large transactions to defraud the organisation that they are a member of. And we see overpaying for goods and services, so collusion, conflicts of interest. So important to review your related party transactions, make sure that the controls around that are really strong. And then a lot of the external frauds that we're coming across are payment frauds, So fraudulent requests to change supplier details. I'm sure that you are all aware of these types of frauds. I've got a few examples of that. Procurement fraud, so contractors, suppliers, partners, usually often working with internal members of your organisation to commit that kind of fraud. We see fraudulent grant applications, including fictitious charities, false applications. Sometimes we see fraudsters who are donors. So we've seen money laundering with large donations to charities, and that comes back to the due diligence that you might conduct on the donors that you deal with. Huge reputational impact, as you would imagine, of dealing with donations from a source that is perhaps criminal in its origin. And then Jason will talk a little bit about cyber. So we see ransomware, phishings, etc. I won't talk about that. I'll leave that to Jason. But if we move on to the next slide, and this is where the slides get a little bit busy, but I think there's a lot of information in there that is perhaps interesting. If I talk a little bit about payment diversion frauds, we know from the survey that we've done that this is one of the top 3 types of frauds that organisations within the charity and not-for-profit sector have experienced. So we see a lot of this type of fraud. We see letters that have been sent that are fraudulent letters, where supplier details have been changed in order to make payments to fraudulent third parties. And the aim is to divert a payment that should have been made to a genuine supplier to the fraudster. And so sometimes we've seen letters that have been sent to an internal division of a charity rather than the head office. Instructions were provided to change the bank details, sent to an internal division of a UK charity instead of the head office. The request was then sent on to the head office. The internal transfer of the change request led to an assumption at head office that due diligence checks had already been carried out on the request. The payments were then made to the new account details to the fraudster, and they were made until the genuine supplier alerted the organisation or the charity that those payments had not been made to them. And in this particular example, there was over £1 million worth of loss. So those very simple, a very, very simple fraud there can lead to very large losses, and it can be extremely difficult to get those monies back from the bank. I don't know if any of you have got experience of dealing with frauds where you are requesting information from banks, but it is extremely difficult to get information on the ultimate destination of those funds. So some top tips on how you can protect yourself: verify the supplier details directly with the supplier. When verifying those details, never, never, ever use the information that has been provided to you on the change request, email or letter. Always obtain that information from an independent source, such as the website, or through directory inquiries, such as 192.com. Have a process, test it regularly, and make sure that it works. Now, another way that we see this kind of fraud, the payment diversion fraud, is through phone calls, and this is often through social engineering, and this is why training is so very, very important to your organisation. So we've got lots of examples of low value fraud leading to significant additional issues. One of the victims that we worked with suffered a loss after a phone call was made from a fraudster to change a legitimate supplier's bank details, and it actually led to this particular organisation failing to pay their insurance premiums. Now, this was insurance premiums that covered professional indemnity insurance, buildings insurance, etc. And so it meant that when they did suffer an incident that should have been covered by their insurance, they were not in fact covered because they had failed to make the payments to their legitimate insurance provider and they had been diverted. Now, that insurance provider had not alerted this particular charity to the fact that those insurance premiums had not been made. And so that there was no awareness of the fact that this money had been diverted. Social engineering is often used by fraudsters here, where they will develop a relationship with members of your organization. So they will call, they'll develop a relationship, perhaps posing as somebody from your bank or from a supplier, or from we've even seen it where they've been posing as a peer from another charity, and they'll develop a relationship and ask quite seemingly innocuous questions like, are you on holiday? Are you doing any, or we've just done a large transaction where we've just sold a property, etc. And so we've got an example of where a fraudster had phoned a charity and posed as somebody from a law firm, saying that the charity's bank details had been compromised. And then they had information from previous phone calls that they'd made, which made them appear legitimate. It added weight to the fact that they said that they were calling from the lawyers, this particular charity's bank accounts had been compromised, and that the charity needed to make some urgent payments to divert funds from a particular bank account in order to keep those funds safe. And some top tips here are just never feel pressurized to take urgent steps when a caller calls describing how a bank account's been compromised. Always take time to think and run a sense check. Banks will never, ever call you and ask you to transfer funds in order to keep them safe. Never share your PIN number or card devices with others. Be aware of social engineering. Make sure that you have training on social engineering so that you're aware of the kind of things that you might be asked for and the sensitivity around providing what might appear to be simple and riskless information to a third party. Another kind of thing that we see a lot is misappropriation of assets. This is the theft of cash and assets. One of the case studies we've got here is that part of one of the assistant management accountant's roles was to arrange payments for the organisation's overseas operations. She was also a member of the payment releasing team, which meant that she had authority to create and release payments requested by various departments. She was trusted. She'd been in the organisation a number of years, and it was only after her departure that the organisation was alerted to irregularities. And what she'd done is that she disguised payments to herself as payments to overseas-based employees and suppliers, and she'd done that in two different ways. She was editing and resending legitimate emails, and she was using these as supporting documents to authorise fraudulent payments to herself. She'd created a bank transfer for a transaction that had already been paid in cash. We identified that there were no controls in place to prevent this. And the investigation that we conducted revealed a minimum of 130 suspect payments that had been made by the fraudster to herself over 5 years. And the top tips for there were just to review payment authority levels on a regular basis, make sure that no one can unilaterally create and release payments, and conduct regular checks like variance analysis so that you can carry out regular reconciliations. Make sure that the whole team knows that you conduct these regular checks, coming back to the culture point that we talked about at the start. I'm just conscious of time and I don't want to take any time from Jason. So I just think it's important to just to reiterate at the end here that culture really is everything. So when you think about the fraud response plan that you have, make sure that you are incorporating regular reviews of your culture as you conduct those regular sense checks of how your organisation is operating, the risks that you are facing, and the procedures and controls that you have in place to manage those risks. Okay, so I am going to hand over to my colleague, Jason. I'm happy to take questions at the end.
Thank you so much, Kaylee. Over to Jason.
Thanks, Kaylee. Thanks, Joel. So Jason Gottschalk, I'm one of the partners within Digital Risk Advisory Services. And today we're going to be focusing on demystifying cyber. I've got some interesting slides around some data coming out of the market, which I've extracted from the Verizon data breach data that's freely available on the internet. And if you've never heard of the Verizon report, you should go have a look at it. It's free to download and super informative. So on the slide, I talk about threat actors, and the reason we talk about threat actors is that cyber is, saying you want to have a resilient environment against potential cyber threats is a bit like saying you want to be good at playing sports. And obviously, as Kaylee's discussed through her slides, the threat landscape in terms of where potential risk can be introduced and result in some sort of fraud occurring, or breach or loss or three in any shape, way or form, it's quite extensive. So what we do is we work with organizations to really focus on understanding the threat landscape, and we do this through the discussion of threat actors. And essentially, there are four main categories of threat actors. And as we go through this, we'll start to understand how these threat actors apply to your sector and your specific organization, and why it is that you should focus on certain types of threat actors, because those threat actors behave in a certain manner, in which case you would build your control environment around that. So we're going to go through them at a very high level, and we'll revisit them as we go through the rest of the slides, and we'll have Q&A at the end. So if there are any questions around this, we can go through it in a lot more detail. So essentially, the first one is the hacktivist, and the hacktivist really operates using technology to make a political statement. Generally, very active when there's some sort of political or environmental type event that's happening, and you can generally plot their activity based on these political or environmental type activities. So typically the hacktivist was most active. We saw them many years ago around, major oil spills. Oil companies responsible or associated would be targeted by activists, and really creating a bit of a nuisance factor for those organizations. And as we see the environmental agenda really continue to rise, hacktivists are getting noticed more, but actually, there seems to be a bit of sentiment change around the activists. And then for your own organizations, I suppose you can kind of look at that and go, well, does that threat actor apply to me? And as we go through, I'll talk a bit about a case that happened with a charity and a hacktivist type attack, and we can kind of discuss that maybe during the Q&A. State sponsored, that's your typical kind of China, Russia, UK, USA, and everyone targeting each other. Typically, we've seen a lot of increased state-sponsored type activity during COVID. So, we saw a number of nation states targeting the UK, specifically universities for IP, and most recently around the COVID-19 type research and vaccinations and vaccine information and data and so on and so forth. So once again, if you think about the state-sponsored type of threat act in context of yourself, would they particularly target you? Given their modus operandi, and they're after IP, they're after large utilities. They want to either sit there and monitor or cause damage in some sort of conflict type environment. So, typically for your sector, you could probably say state-sponsored is probably not one that's high on your agenda. Now, the insider is probably for me the one that's high up on the risk profile for your sector, and as Kaylee mentioned, there's a lot of insider type risk, and typically insiders come in two categories: those that knowingly or unknowingly introduce risk into the environment. And typically, unknowingly would be myself, one of you on this call, that would do something unknowingly introducing risk into the environment. So responding to a phishing email, updating payment beneficiaries, that's kind of just going about your day-to-day activities and introducing risk. And then there's the malicious insider that will want to perpetrate some sort of fraud. And at this stage, we see a lot of insiders that will work with organized crime. And there's almost like a symbiotic relationship in some respects with organized crime and insider on the disgruntled side, or wanting to commit a fraud. And sometimes the insider will just be in a position where they're tempted to create a fraud, but sometimes the organized crime unit will approach somebody within these organizations, or even plant people within these organizations to perpetrate some sort of fraud. So if you kind of stand back and you look at typically how these different threat actors operate and how they would target you, it becomes quite clear as to where you should focus your cyber controls. And typically organized crime and insider would be much higher on your threat profile, in which case you would focus more on the types of threats that they pose and build your control environment around that. If I could get the next slide, please. Brilliant. So what I've done over here is I've extracted some interesting slides from the Verizon data breach data, and it's once again it's a free report, and I really urge you to download it. It makes for good reading. So the first slide, which is patterns in breaches, this is when there's what the data is telling us is it's telling us that when there is a breach, typically social engineering accounts for almost 40% of how the breach occurred. So it's patterns. So if you kind of look from bottom up, lost or stolen assets, privilege misuse, system kind of bypass, and basic web-based vulnerabilities pretty much score quite low down on the pattern vector, so to speak. So what we're essentially saying is 38 to 40% of all breaches will occur through some sort of social engineering type attack, which can be a phishing type attack. And it doesn't always have to be phishing. It comes in many different types of forms. And if we move over to figure 7, what we're looking at over there is 85% of breaches involve a human element. And that's, I'm pretty sure that's not going to surprise anyone in any shape, way, or form. And then 61% still involving credentials. And that's consistent with what we're seeing in the marketplace. Some interesting commentary that came out of the report. So business email compromise doubling from last year. Web-based email is a favorite target. So we're seeing a lot of compromise of externally published mailboxes. And they are, that's an easy entry into the organization. We're all human. We tend to reuse passwords as much as we try and make them complicated. We've got 17 different passwords, and generally, it's difficult to manage passwords, so we kind of reuse it, and hackers are aware of that. So controls like multi-factor authentication, where you've got a PIN or a text that comes through to a different device, is really helpful in neutralizing that type of threat. What's really interesting for me is the bottom one, which is in red. So of a sample of almost 1,200 people that received a real and simulated phishing attack. So this is when we go in and we do simulated phishing attacks. None of them clicked the simulated phishing email, but when it came time to actually look at the environment in the long term, 2.5% clicked the real phishing email, which means that essentially these phishing simulations, they provide some context in terms of building muscle memory, and there's definitely benefit in running them, but the risk still remains that a small percentage is going to at some point click the real phishing email. If I could get the next slide, please. So just kind of reflecting on the threat actors and just kind of looking at your own organizations. Organized crime in terms of threat actors really, accounts for a large majority of frauds and breaches that happen. But what's really, really interesting is that, that organized crime unit needs an insider in order to sometimes perpetrate that fraud. So they need somebody on the inside that they can coerce through social engineering, either through phishing or phone call, as Kaylee said, phoning up and pretending to be from a law firm, and kind of causing that to happen. So the two do go hand in hand. If you kind of look at motives of breaches, no surprise, it's financially driven, and that's not going to be a surprise to anyone, because criminals are in the business of making money. And generally, if you look at the other types of motivations, so espionage, that would be related to your nation state type of activities, and generally if you look at the plotting of espionage activities by nation states, it's generally aligned to global events that are taking place, so significant changes. So if you kind of look when Donald Trump took over the presidency in the USA, there was a large amount of nation state activities around espionage and so on and so forth. And all over time, even around Brexit, there was you could see the increase. So generally, you kind of you have these peaks and troughs associated with other threat actors, whereas cyber criminals, they're pretty consistent. You got to give it to them. They are financially motivated. So just kind of looking at the next slide. So I've kind of extracted the actors in finance, because I think it's there's obviously a large financial component to what you guys do, so it's still really applicable. But what you're seeing at the moment is you're seeing the internal threat vector starting to increase. So you see an upward trend in terms of internal type financial frauds occurring, and external kind of not decreasing, but just in proportion to the insider threat, you're seeing that increase, which kind of correlates to what my fellow presenters have said, is that you're seeing that internal kind of threat vector increasing. So one to watch out for. And I think the takeaway from that is that you need to start looking at the insider threat more and more on the malicious side, and not that you need to say it's less on the unintended, kind of I did it by accident type of introducing risk into the environment, but threat actors are becoming, from an internal perspective, genuinely more focused. So as we move into the next slide, what we're seeing from a technology perspective, and I'm working with a large charity at the moment that is moving from a heavy on-premise environment to a cloud-based environment. So you're probably all going through some sort of digital transformation, and things are changing. Is that what we're seeing at the moment is the system administrator is because things are now centralized, and the system administrator generally as a role has access to a lot of systems. Systems are becoming a lot more integrated. There's less manual intervention from a human, in which case, processes pretty much run in many respects end-to-end automated. That system administrator risk is starting to increase. So, it can be increased from, miscellaneous type of errors, but it also can be, really targeted and intended impact from a system administrator. So as we move from left to right, what we're seeing over here is if you kind of look at the internal threat actor varieties in terms of error breaches, and you kind of look at the reason why, you're seeing a lot of misconfigurations around configurations in your environment that is resulting in a breach. So that's the movement. And if you're looking at the discovery in timelines in privilege misuse, so this is where I alluded to the fact that system administrators are now having greater access and greater control over the environment. You're seeing a significant increase in the timeline in terms of discovery of a potential misuse of that privilege access. So what we're basically seeing from the data is that up to 40% of instances where there was a system administrated misuse of privileged access, it took years to really identify that, and kind of the data is almost showing, months seems to be a consistent kind of, it's almost the middle ground in terms of what we're seeing across the data. So it's normalized. That's the word I was looking for. Months is typically how long it takes for that discovery to take place. So as we move on to the next slide, if we look at on the left, we've got top data, varieties, and breaches, which is basically the type of data that was breached during the incident, and versus the type of data that was breached in terms of error. So to bring that home, so on the left, it was I'm a hacker or I'm an insider and I'm being malicious, and that's the data that I'm breaching. And on the right, it's I work for the organization and I sent out some content, a spreadsheet with some personal information by accident. So the left-hand side, when there's a breach, they're stealing credentials, number one, which kind of makes sense because they want to breach the environment, they want to get access to mailboxes, they want to extend access within the environment, move laterally, map it out, understand the payments that are being generated, what invoices are coming in, and to kind of create and script a scenario upon which they can extract a fraud. Generally, personal information is it's stolen, but it's stolen from an extortion perspective. So we steal the data because we actually want to extort money out of the organization. So typical scenarios, ransomware, as Kaylee mentioned, we've breached the environment, we've loaded the ransomware, we've stolen your data, and now we're going to extort you for that. But typically, it's not necessarily of super value to an organized crime unit other than for extortion. Generally credentials is what they're after, and they're looking to laterally move through the organization. Whereas in error, it's typically only going to be personal information that's not only, it's largely personal information that is breached in error, accounting for almost 80% of all data that was noted in the breach on the error side. So just moving on to the next slide and just trying to summarize things before I hand back to Jill. And I think we've made good time, so we'll have lots of time for Q&A. So, for me as somebody that works with a number of clients to try and improve cyber posture, I think it's very, very important and critical actually to understand your specific risk profile, understand what your crown jewels are. So if you look at threat actors, who's going to attack me, how are they going to attack me, and what are they going to steal? And if you think about the 4 threat actors in terms of your organization, each one generally has a modus operandi. They have there's a control environment that you can put in place to try and mitigate that risk, and understanding where your threats are really, really hones that in and helps you really identify where your risk is and build your control environment. Phishing presents the greatest risk to most organizations, and remember that the financial motivation behind criminal activity is the driving factor. Generally, a organized crime unit will need an insider in order to perpetrate the crime, and therefore they go hand in hand. So that's super important to take note of. And awareness training is the best defense to aid employees in identifying phishing type attacks and preventing them. And there's a bit of a message here around phishing type training. So typically organizations, they do phishing training, and there's almost, 2 categories of how organizations react to awareness training. So typically they would run an awareness training session, and then we would do a simulated phishing type attack. Where there's a response to the phishing type attack, there tends to be a bit of the 2 camps are negative. So why did you click on this? You should have picked this up, you should have known this, you should have, really kind of not a good message around, the learning process of the phishing campaign. And then the other side, which is quite positive, kind of not making light of the situation, but bringing out a bit of a camaraderie around the fact, did you spot it? No, I missed it. Okay, this is what I saw. Oh yeah, I missed that. And creating a positive spin on the training. And the reason for that is, as we noted in the data, at some point somebody's going to click on a phishing email, and generally when that person clicks on that phishing email, you want to create an environment of encouragement for that person to say, look, I'm not sure whether I clicked on a phishing email or not. I'm concerned. I want to raise my hand. Can we investigate and check? And I'm actually not sure. Versus creating that negative connotation through the training and then subsequently whether the person clicks on it. So, you want to create an environment where people are happy and comfortable and feel safe to raise their hand to create awareness around phishing emails. So on that note, I'm going to hand back to Joel for some Q&A. Thanks everyone for your time.
Thank you so much, Jason, Kaylee, and Mia. Some lots and lots to think about. And of course, as Charities, we're holding such a huge amount of sensitive data on our beneficiaries and on our donors. So I think the frequency of attack has definitely gone up. And it was interesting. I was at an audit committee yesterday with the charity, and we had a very good discussion around the likelihood of an attack. And having spoken to Jason and had a number of my clients unfortunately suffer cyber attacks this year, I think it's more of a case of when it happens, not if it happens. So I do apologise. We have had a technical issue with our Q&A function. So I tried to submit a question through it and saw that it was disabled. So apologies for that. Does anyone have a question for any of our three panelists? Please don't be shy. Turn on your camera, turn off mute, and please do ask. I do have a few questions that have been sent through in advance following people reading the survey, but really just to give an opportunity for anyone that we have on the call to pose a question to our lovely panelists.
Can I just say, Jill, while we're waiting for a question?
Of course.
One of the things that I found is really, really helpful is to talk to your peers. So if you are the financial controller at a charity, it's really fantastic if you can talk to your peer within the sector, and have open conversations. Of course, not disclose any confidential information, but so that you can be aware of, well, actually, we've come across this or we've seen this, because we can talk about trends that we see, and the kind of things that we've helped out with. But there's nothing that's as valuable as being able to talk to somebody who really does live and breathe the same role that you have. So if you can do that, that is a really great thing.
Super. One question that we got in advance, which I will just pose, was we talked about insider fraud. And interestingly, we had a query through around whether we'd experienced any trustees perpetrating that fraud, or is it normally employees? So any difference between volunteers and employees?
Well, from my perspective, unfortunately not. I think that the fraud can be posed, well, the risks can be posed as equally from paid employees and volunteers. We often refer to something called the fraud triangle, which is a piece of research that was conducted decades ago, but it's still extremely valid today. And that talks about opportunity. And actually, it's around the opportunities that people have to commit fraud within your charity or not-for-profit organisation, and that can come from volunteers, and it can come from paid employees. It can come right from the top of an organisation. We've seen, unfortunately, chief execs who have committed frauds, trustees who've committed them, volunteers, finance departments, fundraisers, you name it, unfortunately. So you've got to be really vigilant and have a really healthy level of professional skepticism when you are dealing with money. And in today's environment, where you have social media and everyone is in the spotlight, and you know that your stakeholders are really interested in what is going on, and that the appetite for information and the ability to get that information is so vast. you cannot underestimate the impact that it can have on an organisation. So you do have to be really vigilant everywhere.
Yeah, I completely agree, Kaylee. Maybe a question for Mia. Chris has asked whether there's a forum for charities to report instances of fraud other than action fraud that we're all familiar with, because that may help to share intelligence and experiences.
Yeah, sure. Thanks very much, Jill. So obviously we would always recommend if an organisation has suffered a fraud, they should report it to action fraud. That is where law enforcement can take action, and also helps build a better picture about what's happening in the sector to help hopefully forewarn other charities about potential risks. But there are a number of informal networks that exist that charities can join. One of those that we belong to is something called the Charities Against Fraud Group. It is set up under the auspices of the Charity Commission, and that brings together people working within the sector who want to share information and hear from experts in and around the subject of fraud and cybercrime. It's made up principally of people working either in counter fraud or risk management or internal audit or finance within charities. And it's led by a gentleman called Dave Carter, who's head of counter fraud at the British Council. So it's very much led by the sector. And it just provides an informal forum where we can talk about what we're seeing, what frauds are affecting us. And it also helps us build those networks with other peers, where when we do see something that we're not sure about, we have those connections and those relationships to be able to go and talk to others working within the sector to see either A, if they're witnessing something similar, or to seek their advice and support on an informal basis. Because actually, you know, sometimes when you talk to somebody else, they've experienced the same thing and they know how to deal with it, and they know where to go for further information and advice and support. So really important. It's a free network. You're more than welcome, anybody on the call who wishes to join that. You can contact me and I can pop you on that list.
Really helpful. Thank you so much, Mia. And I would also recommend, you know, regardless of the size of the fraud, reporting it through as a serious incident to the Charity Commission, because the Charity Commission are really keen to gather that information and share, you know, the experiences that others are happening to prevent this happening again. A question for Jason, maybe a bit of an unfair one, but one that's cropped up at a lot of audit committees that I've been at recently, is how easy is it to get cyber insurance at the moment?
Good question. So at the moment, I think if you're a first-time purchaser, it's easier. You know, I think what we're seeing now is we're seeing a significant increase in premiums associated with incidents that have taken place from a cyber perspective, whether you've invoked your policy or not. So you know, and that would make sense in context of what you'd expect from the insurance sector, but it's gone up significantly. The increases have gone up significantly because the industry is relatively, from a cyber insurance perspective, it's still quite new, and they're still trying to find their feet in terms of what that balance looks like. But it's becoming very expensive, you know, essentially, and that's going to be a continual trend upwards. So, you know, basically, you know, having a strong cyber posture, before the insurance companies were showing leniency, now there isn't much. And if you invoke your insurance, you know, they will come in and do an assessment generally, and if they find deficient areas, they may not insure components of the business, and that's what we're seeing. So it's an ever-changing landscape, and across the population you'll see different changes. But you know, there's some really interesting stats. If you look at the larger organizations that have taken up, you know, account for, let's say, 40% of the premiums globally, if they were, any one of those four were to incur significant breach that would result in significant claims, you'd find the pool of cyber insurance premiums pretty much being wiped out by that top 40%. So, you know, that's what's driving the in inverted commas, the inflation or the increase in cyber insurance.
Yeah, it's I've had one client who experienced a ransomware attack, and luckily they were insured. And of course, a huge amount of management time trying to remedy it, but being able to, you know, employ consultants to be able to assist with that, I think there's, and have that covered by the insurance was a kind of, yeah, small mercy. So
can I just jump in on that very quickly, Jill?
Yeah,
it's worth pointing out, it's it seems so obvious, but it is always worth checking that you have insurance to cover the professional services that you might need if you have a fraud as well. Because often the premiums that you add on to cover you for that are very, very small, actually, and the cover that you can get can be significant. And I've often worked with charities where they've got the cover and they've had quite significant professional services fees and that have been covered by their insurance. So that's been really helpful.
Super. So worth doing an insurance review, definitely, to make sure that these risks are covered. We've got, I think, one final question from Parul. How do clients start to assess their health and fitness to prevent or identify fraud?
Well, I would, first of all, if you're not already doing that, I would identify a few key members of the organisation with different perspectives, different roles, different departments, often a senior person and definitely somebody more junior within the organisation because their perspective is different. I would convene on a regular basis, think about the risks that you face as an organisation, talk about some of the incidents that you might have experienced as an organisation, and think about what controls and procedures you've got in place to make sure that those risks are minimised. And I would document it. I would have a fraud response plan. So if you are to experience fraud, what are you going to do about it? So, for example, if you experience a fraud, it's often when, you know, the chief exec or the finance director has got their bags packed and they're about to take the kids on holiday, and a Sunday night you're notified about it. Well, what do? How do you close down their ability to access your systems, your bank accounts, their electronic data, and your electronic systems? Can you stop them from getting access into the building? How will you make sure that you've got a small group of people who are dealing with it? Who's going to manage the internal and external comms? Document all of that so that you are ready and prepared to go.
Yeah, super. And I think if any clients are on the call who have an internal audit function, I think having that independent review, a specific fraud internal audit is really, really helpful. I know I've got a few clients on the call who have had that recently, where I sit as the external auditor, and that's been really, really valuable just to identify some potential risks and then be able to mitigate those.
Yeah, and I have it on the agenda, always, absolutely on the agenda. Where you put it on the agenda depends on how seriously people take it. So if you want to have a culture of zero tolerance, it's on the top of the agenda at all of your senior management meetings, and you're communicating that through your organisation, and you are actively managing communications. If you do fall victim of a fraud, you can actually get some positives out of that. So what have you done about it? Make sure that people know about it so that you are creating that culture of zero tolerance all the time, and you are reinforcing that communication across the organisation.
Super. Thank you so much. So look, just to conclude, a huge thanks to Kaylee, Jason and Mia. Really, really helpful session. Hope you found it helpful. Thanks for everyone for joining us. Lots of things to take away. Please do have a look at all of the references that we've mentioned. We will send through links to those as well when we send through the slide pack and the recording. Please remain skeptical. Please look at the training that you're giving to staff. And, you know, one of my recent experiences was due to loss of assets. Please don't forget if you have any heritage assets as well. They are often forgotten. So a huge thanks to all of our speakers, to all of our participants. We have our next charity webinar coming up in the new year. That's our technical update. We had over 400 people sign up to that last year, so please get in quick, watch the website, join the mailing list if you're not already on it, and watch our social media as well. We'll be posting details of that shortly. So thank you so much and enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you.